I've been very impressed by Angus ever since I first met him. I think he is the best person to lead the Liberal Party at this time. He is a person of high intellect, strong convictions, good character, and he's off to a good start. I think a whole lot of the kind of politically correct nonsense, which has been too prevalent, will be instantly dispensed with if Angus becomes Prime Minister.
The Australian way of life is under threat like never before. Sectarian violence is rife on our streets. The political class is silencing mainstream Australians under the guise of hate speech. And the media, universities and major civic organisations continue to fan the flames of division. Australia is without leadership and Australians are losing hope. 2026 will be the year that defines the future of our great nation. Are we up to the task? Hello, Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers and listeners. Great to be back for another chat today. Today, Tony will be sharing his insights about the Liberal Party leadership change and how that is going, plus a speech Tony gave at the Advance Australia conference in particular in relation to migration, and the Aspire conference, which is being held in Sydney, a very important conference, plus a couple of other matters we'll talk about. So, Tony, great to be back with you today.
Dan, it's wonderful to be with you and our listeners yet again.
Look, just before we get into the topics, I just wanted to ask you about how your book's going. The reason I ask is because I saw an article on the way in the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age newspapers, and they were reporting that your book is performing very well, and in fact much better than one of your predecessors. So that's wonderful news, and perhaps you could give us an update on the voluminous sales of your great book.
Well, Dan, look, I don't know exactly how these measurements work, but there's one measurement called BookScan, which I think measures what registered booksellers have provided, and I think that says there's been 55,000 sales.
Wow.
But a couple of weeks ago, I was called up by Sky and told that there'd been 65,000 sales, and I gather that covers a whole lot of other outlets which are not otherwise recorded. So look, one way or another, it seems to be doing extremely well, and I hope as many people as possible read it because, honestly, we have a good story to tell as a nation, and we don't tell it often enough. Far too often people dwell on the occasional blemishes. They dwell on the shade and not on the light, and I think there is so much light to be had in our history, and that's why I think everyone should read it. And if you know anyone who you think should read it, give them a book.
Well, I do know someone, and his name's Angus Taylor, and I'm sure he's read it from front to back. But if he hasn't, Tony, then it might be an opportune time to get him a copy because as new Liberal leader, he appears to have hit the ground running. And of course, there has been a change. There probably needed to be a change of the leadership given where things were headed. So I'm interested in your perspective, Tony. I know you've written about the change and you've written and talked a lot about Angus, but just give our viewers a sense and a feel of the Angus Taylor that you know and why you think he might be the right person to lead the party at this time.
Well, I've been very impressed by Angus ever since I first met him about a year before the 2013 election. He's a very likeable person. He's got a solid record of achievement, both as a farmer and as a business person and as a family man before coming into the parliament. Since coming into the parliament, he's been a successful local member. He's been a successful minister and cabinet minister. I've got to know him particularly well through the annual Polypedal charity bike ride, which he now convenes. This was the bike ride that I started 20-odd years ago. And when I left the parliament, Angus took over the convenership, and we're continuing to raise money for worthy causes by cycling about 1,000 kilometres every year through parts of Australia that don't normally get a visit from a senior political leader. The fact that Angus has been prepared to take on this charitable work, the fact that he's prepared to put himself out for good causes and to get to parts of the country that most senior politicians don't get to, speaks very well of him to me. So look, I regard Angus as a close friend. I think he is the best person to lead the Liberal Party at this time. He is a person of high intellect, strong convictions, good character, and I certainly agree with you, Dan. He's off to a good start. I think by saying that his fundamental purpose is not just to restore Australian standard of living, but also to protect our way of life, means that he's interested in the culture of the country as well as simply about the economy of the country. Now, I absolutely accept that you can't have a community without an economy to sustain us, but there are all sorts of important issues right now beyond the economy, and they're important as well. We need to be proud of our country if our country is to progress, and that means that we have to have just one flag. We don't need to have welcomes to country at every official event, because why do we need to be welcome to our own country? We need to, I think, insist that there are only two genders. I think a whole lot of the kind of politically correct nonsense, which has been too prevalent, will be instantly dispensed with if Angus becomes Prime Minister.
I wanted to ask you about something that gets brought up with me a fair bit, which is about policy. And a lot of people are saying the Liberal Party needs to have policy and it needs to be comprehensive and it needs to go out now. Now, I absolutely agree you need to have policy before you go to the next election. But my view is that this is the time to really keep the focus on the government and to establish what you referred to as in the past as the battle lines of, what will be the topics we take forward. So my view is they shouldn't rush too quickly into getting a whole bunch of policy detail out, because then the debate will be about the Liberals' policy detail rather than the government. So I'm interested in your perspective of where they should be at this point in time.
Well, they certainly don't need to go to the, I suppose, extremes of John Hewson in 1992 with Fight Back. Now, Fight Back at one level was a magisterial achievement, and it did provide a blueprint for the subsequent Howard government. But it was also a huge target for Paul Keating at the 1993 election, and he didn't miss. I think somewhere between having very little policy, if any, and having a comprehensive manifesto that attempts to deal with everything is the sweet spot for an opposition. Essentially, what an opposition needs to do is to identify the key problems and challenges facing the country and have a clear alternative position to that of the government. Now, it doesn't need to be worked out to every last detail, but it does need to be sufficiently worked out to be credibly explained to sometimes sceptical voters, and that's what the opposition has to do. Now, to give an example that we've often talked about, Dan, energy policy. Now, it's terrific that the coalition has well and truly dumped any commitment to net zero, but in the end, what we really need is an energy system that gives us affordable and reliable power. And as we've said on numerous occasions, I think the key elements there are no more coal-fired power stations to close, get gas out of the ground as quickly as possible, end all the subsidies for renewables, including subsidies for electric vehicles, because if these things really are cheap, they don't need subsidies. And finally, end the nuclear ban. Now, I think that people understand that these measures will make a difference. Likewise, in immigration, I don't think we need to be able to specify exactly how many overseas students institution X or institution Y will have, but I think we do need to say that over time, we expect these educational institutions that are really selling immigration, not schooling. We do have to say to these educational institutions, you've got to wean yourself off overseas students as a business model, because all the statistics suggest that something like 60 to 70% of the people coming as overseas students really want to stay in Australia.
Well, let's move into that discussion a bit more about migration and the conference that was held over the weekend by Advance Australia. I had the opportunity to go there and present, and as did you. And I thought it was an excellent conference, bringing people together in Sydney to discuss basically where to go next as a centre right and as a movement, not just focused on the Liberal Party, but the broader set of ideas and the campaigning infrastructure and so forth. Your speech was part of it was focused on the issue of migration. And what I found interesting about your speech is you went into a little bit of detail about what you might like to see. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you referenced a foreign workers tax or something to that effect to discourage corporations who favour foreign workers when they may be able to find domestic equivalents. So I think our viewers and listeners would be interested in what you meant by that and also your broader perspective on where to now on that topic.
Well, thank you, Dan. Look, almost 10% of the people resident in Australia are not permanent residents. We've got almost 1 million people on student visas. We've got over 500,000 people on temporary work visas. We've got over 100,000 people on bridging visas because they don't want to leave the country as they have been ordered to do so. They're appealing deportation orders effectively. So we've got this vast number of people in the country on a non-permanent basis. And it seems to me that this is hardly good for us as an economy or as a society, because we want the people here to be committed to the country in a way that temporary residents can't really be. So in terms of all of these foreign workers, and look, you only have to go to a nursing home, to a hotel, to a cafe or restaurant. You've only got to jump into an Uber or a taxi to appreciate how many people are in this country on a sort of longish term but temporary basis. And essentially, this is because there are some jobs that, for all sorts of reasons, Australians don't particularly want to do. Now, rather than bring people in from overseas, either on a specific temporary work visa or recruited from the overseas student population to do these jobs, I really think that we need to do three things. First of all, I think we need to be prepared to pay people more to do some of these jobs. I think we've got to be prepared to train people more to do some of these jobs. But I also think we need to adjust the welfare system so that it's a little harder for people who are otherwise able to work not to work. And this, of course, is something that I really had a lot to do with as a minister in the Howard government. When in the employment portfolio, I was responsible for a program known as Work for the Dole. I think this was one of the key achievements of the Howard government. I think it was one of the reasons why, under the Howard government, unemployment fell very substantially from close to 10% to about 4%, because we said to people who were under 50 and had been more than 6 months on unemployment benefits, well, we would like you to work for a wage, but if for whatever reason you can't work for a wage, we are going to have a very strong expectation, indeed a compulsion, that you work for the dole. And I think that not only is this good economics, but I think it's a sound moral principle to end this something-for-nothing entitlement mindset, which has unfortunately become all too entrenched in large sections of the Australian population. I mean, at a time when a lot of businesses say they can't find workers for unskilled jobs, there are still close to 1 million people on activity-tested unemployment benefits. And I think we've got to address this if we are going to be the more dynamic economy and the more cohesive society that we should be.
Mm. And I think with the job vacancies, I think there's something like 300,000 that they have on the Australian Bureau of Statistics website. which is still about 1/3 higher than it was pre-COVID. Despite that, we've brought in something like 1.5 million on a net basis over that period since COVID. So how can you have a skills shortage and have so many people coming in? Obviously, left hand's not talking to right hand in the government. You also mentioned just if you could elaborate on the idea of a foreign worker tax. What was that idea and what did you think it would achieve?
Well, as you know, Dan, you are not supposed to bring people into this country to do a job if locals are readily available to do it. Now, I think the best way to ensure that we don't have the displacement of local workers by possibly cheaper overseas workers is if for every person on a temporary work visa, there needs to be paid a foreign workers tax. Now, if that was, say, $5,000 or $10,000 a year, for argument's sake, that would mean that it would be almost never in the interests of a business to have a foreign worker as opposed to a local worker, and it really would only be jobs that locals cannot be found for that we would have people coming in from overseas to do. So I just think we've got to be a lot more rigorous about bringing people into this country. We've got to be more rigorous about whether they're really skilled. We've got to be more rigorous about whether they're really necessary to do the jobs that they're in. We've got to be more rigorous about their commitment to Australian values if they're here for any length of time. And I think a foreign workers tax is certainly a richly prospective way of ensuring that we are only bringing in for Australian jobs people when there really is no local person who can do it.
Hi, thanks for watching. Did you know that 3/4 of you watching this podcast aren't currently subscribed to the IPA's YouTube channel? So do us a favour, hit subscribe and you won't miss any of the action. While you're at it, head to ipa.org.au, follow the prompts to subscribe to the IPA's website, so that way you will find all of our research and analysis. Now back to the chat.
Well, it will be interesting to see how your idea is received in the party, because there'll be traditional economic liberals that will oppose it, I suspect, on the basis that they don't want taxes, and they'll say that businesses should be able to access foreign labour if they want, and there'll be others who say that we need to protect the domestic workforce better. So the major cleavage, I think, in the party is the economic liberals and economic nationalists is one of the big points of differentiation, and immigration is a real flashpoint in that debate. And one of the things the party is going to need to deal with is if and when they announce substantial cuts to migration under a government that they have, the usual suspects, particularly the Treasury types, will say you're going to crash the economy. And I think there's two parts to this. One is, well, firstly, we're looking at this from a cultural lens, not just an economic lens. But secondly, as you've mentioned, particularly with the foreign students, but others, far too much of the migration program sadly has become a scam, an uneconomic scam that is undermining our per capita prosperity, not just the headline GDP. But I'm interested in your advice on, and I'm sure this came up around the cabinet table when you were there many, many times, including when you were leader, which is how would you deal with that argument when Treasury and the others say that this will crash the economy?
Well, you're right. Treasury has used immigration as a lazy way to keep economic growth going when governments don't want to actually take the tough decisions needed for genuine economic reform and genuine greater efficiency. So there is no doubt that people will use these arguments. And yet, if you look at the results, under the Albanese government, 7 of the last 11 quarters have produced negative GDP per person. And we are actually, if you look at the statistics, worse off in terms of GDP per person now than we were 3 or 4 years ago. So high immigration is not actually making us more rich. High immigration is currently making us more poor because, on average, it seems, the productivity of the people coming in is lower than the existing citizenry's productivity. So this is something that just has to be resisted. I mean, we simply cannot be slaves to a Treasury dogma, which has proven not to be beneficial to Australia.
Do you think that Angus's shadow cabinet is set up to achieve this outcome? And what I mean by that is when you look at the economic side of his shadow ministry, it's heavy with very economically liberal people, which is fair enough. But will they take the fight to Jim Chalmers on the immigration issue because immigration will morph into an economic issue and therefore will be handled by the shadows who are responsible for the Treasury component of it? Do you think with the current construction that is an argument they're going to vigorously prosecute, or does it risk sort of, maybe the horses will get a bit scared by this argument and they'll sort of retreat back to what they used to do?
Well, I think the political difficulty will be we will have some businesses coming to us and saying, look, if we don't have a big pool of workers, many of them from overseas, we will struggle. I think there'll be some farmers who say this. I think there'll be hoteliers and people in the so-called care economy who say this. But again, I think this is where we just have to say, look, we are going to take a holistic approach that will involve some adjustments, upward adjustments to pay. It will involve some enhancements to training, and it will involve some changes to the welfare system so that people on activity-tested benefits really do have to be active. Now, I think this is an argument that we just have to be prepared to prosecute and to win. I mean, this has been the whole problem, Dan, over the last decade or so. Governments have not been prepared to have the tough conversations with people that are needed if our country is to progress. And again, I say the current record levels of migration might be boosting the overall economy, but does anyone really feel richer? I think the clear answer is no. Very few people do feel richer. And if you look at the stats, they back up what all of us feel, given that, as I said, GDP per person has actually fallen in 7 of the last 11 quarters and is lower now than it was when the Albanese government was elected.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I'm going to be interested to see how this plays out, because it's if the focus is just on capital gains tax and not taxing people, the party will be held together. But when we get to the immigration, I will be very interested to see how this plays out within the party and whether the cabinet holds together or whether changes need to be made to make sure the focus is kept on cutting immigration, because there'll be voices that are very strong against that. So that'll be something to look out for. I wanted to ask you about another conference which is held in Sydney in the next couple of days, which is headed up by John Anderson, called Aspire, which I understand is some relation to the ARC conference, which was held in London and also had a Australian branch. I think it was last year or the year before they ran the conference here. So I think this is good news. Having more conferences and more opportunities to voice opinions and perspectives is a positive in this country, because that is something that we've lacked, is a strong centre-right civil society. So for me, it's always the more the better. I'm just interested in what your role is in that and what you hope that this conference might achieve for our country.
Well, thanks, Dan. Yes, as we've discussed previously, there's been a couple of these ARC, as in Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. There's been a couple of these ARC conferences in London now, and there's another one happening in the middle of the year. But the conference that's happening this week in Sydney, Aspire, is essentially the Australian arm of ARC. And I guess the beauty of this conference, unlike so many others, is that it's not just about economics. It's not just about politics. It's not just about national security. It's about culture, because the people who are sponsoring this conference, they understand that politics is downstream of culture, And in a sense, culture is downstream of faith, the things that we believe in, whether that's religion, whether that's society, country. And so this is a holistic conference in a way that so many of the others aren't really. And that's why I'm happy to be part of the organising team. I'm happy to be participating in quite a few of the sessions. Yes, the main organiser is the wonderful John Anderson, the former Deputy Prime Minister, but there's quite a few good people involved, and I certainly think that this is going to be an occasion for several hundred key thinkers and doers in our society to come together and ask ourselves, how can we be better citizens? How can we, I suppose, do more to promote Western civilization, which has been, for all its occasional failings, the finest achievement of mankind so far? Because plainly we are at a civilizational moment. We do have to tell a better story about ourselves. And if we can't manage to recover the faith in ourselves, in our countries, in our societies that was characteristic of times until quite recently, we are stuck in a situation of managed decline. And given all the challenges that we face right now, economic, societal and strategic, that makes events like this really important.
Mm. There was an article in the weekend in The Australian about John Anderson and the conference, and I just want to take a couple of parts out of that and get you to reflect on it. And I just use this as a jumping off point. So I think what John Anderson had said in there a little bit was about what I would describe as his skepticism of Trump and also Farage. I don't have the article in front of me, but the words I think were, I wouldn't have voted for Trump, and he doesn't think that reform is the way to go in the UK. And I think it's related to an argument made by some as well, which tends to have a very sort of cynical or negative view of so-called populism. Some will sort of deride populism as something that needs to be removed from the system and doesn't have validity. I'm not saying John Anderson has said this, but there is an argument that's presented in sort of this establishment centre-right that will sort of deride the populism. And there are others who say, well, no, this is actually the future of the centre-right. If you look anywhere around the Western world that's succeeded, it's been based on basically working class, patriotic, culturally confident people that have lost confidence in the political establishment and looking for a new expression. And the question in Australia is whether that will be the Liberal Party or whether it will be One Nation or some other manifestation. But that is a real thing that's with us and not going away. And it can have different electoral expressions depending on political systems and so forth. So I'm just interested in where you see that going and what your perspective is on that matter.
Well, Dan, look, I would have voted for Trump had I been eligible to vote in the last presidential election, not because I am an unalloyed admirer of the president, but because politics is a choice. And as we know, it's not always a choice between good and great. Sometimes it's a choice between bad and worse. And look, given the choice between Kamala Harris on the one hand and Donald Trump on the other, I certainly would have voted enthusiastically for Donald Trump. And I remain someone who would have voted for Trump, seeing what he's done so far, as against the prospect of a Kamala Harris administration. On the subject of populism, look, populist is a sort of a boo word that people apply to ideas which are popular but which they don't like themselves. So, for instance, if you want to cut immigration, that's supposed to be populist. If you want to stand up for just one flag, that's supposed to be populist. Well, I think both of these ideas are actually popular because the average person understands that they're right and that they make sense. And I think in a country like Australia, when it comes to things they're familiar with, the average person is pretty shrewd. The average person doesn't get it wrong that often when it comes to things they understand. So look, I think the job of the established centre-right parties is to be more effective at recognising and responding to the real problems that people see. And I do think that the reason for the rise of these so-called populist insurgents, Trump himself in the United States, Farage and Reform in Britain, and to a lesser extent, it seems, Pauline Hanson and One Nation in Australia, is that the mainstream centre-right parties have tended to ignore a whole range of legitimate public concerns. Now, I'm confident that under Angus Taylor, the coalition is going to be much better at responding to these concerns. The fact that Angus has made such an issue of protecting our way of life as opposed simply to restoring our standard of living gives me a lot of optimism. Does that mean that One Nation are going to disappear overnight? No, it doesn't. But if you look at the history of One Nation over the last quarter century or so, One Nation has waxed when the mainstream centre-right party, the Liberal Party in coalition with the National Party, has been, shall we say, a bit all over the place. And it's waned, One Nation has waned when the mainstream centre-right has been strong and determined. One Nation had its first real appearance in the late 90s when the Howard government was struggling. But after the Howard government hit its straps, One Nation virtually disappeared. When I was the leader of the coalition, One Nation didn't really make much impact. It was really only after the onset of the revolving door prime ministership that One Nation came back into play. And of course, it surged into consideration since the election. But as I said, I think that with Angus Taylor, the coalition has made an important new start. And let's hope that can be continued.
Just one last question, Tony, on that topic before we wrap up today is the issue of trust. And what I'm going to be interested in is, even if the Liberal Party has great policies and very strong policies and Angus is able to be a very strong and convincing leader, there is the prospect that perhaps the Liberal Party brand has been tarnished to the point where people don't believe that it will do what it says it will do should it form government. And I think this is what's happened a bit in the UK with the Tories, where Kimmy Badenoch, I think, is a very good leader and she's got some very good policies. But particularly when they talk about net zero or immigration or cultural values, a lot of the community in the UK say, well, you were in government for well over 10 years and you actually did the opposite of what you said. So we're sticking with Farage or one of the alternatives. And I just wonder whether there's the risk that that same trust factor has been broken in Australia with the Liberal Party, and this rebuild may not be 6 months, but it may more be like a 6-year operation for people to really start to believe that the party is once again a party truly of the centre-right. So I'm just interested in your thought on that matter.
Well, Dan, I think that the trust issue is much more pronounced in Britain than in Australia, because while the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government was in important respects a disappointment, and I think the revolving door prime ministership was at the heart of that disappointment. The Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak government was a vastly bigger disappointment, again in part because they did have such turnover of ministerial jobs, and it's very hard to deliver anything other than government by the public service if ministers and prime ministers are changing all the time. So look, I accept that there are questions of trust, but I guess if I could just appeal to people who might be tempted to vote for One Nation to first of all give the coalition one last chance. And second, to consider, do they really think that between them, Pauline Hanson and Barnaby Joyce could run a credible, effective government? My fear, certainly in Britain, and to some extent in Australia as well, is that we could go from bad to worse to terrible by rejecting a disappointment in favour of something which is totally unproven and could turn out to be utterly chaotic. I've actually got a piece in the current issue of The Spectator on this very point, Dan. Yes, we are entitled to be disappointed with the coalition, just as the British public are entitled to be furious with the Conservative Party. But their fury against the Conservative Party has actually put them into an even worse position with the current Starmer Labor government in Britain. I like Nigel Farage. I'm impressed by people like Suella Braverman who've gone over to the Reform Party. But this idea that a party which currently has under a dozen seats in the House of Commons could suddenly form a credible, effective, competent government to undo all the damage that's been done over the last decade or so, it's pretty implausible. And in the end, as I said earlier, politics is a choice, and it's rarely a perfect choice. Often we have to choose between a whole range of imperfect options. And I strongly maintain, Dan, certainly in this country, I strongly maintain that the best hope of better government remains the coalition, not because we're perfect, but because we're better than any practical alternative.
Great. All right, Tony, we'll leave it there on that optimistic call to arms. So thanks again for your time and insights, and we'll catch up in about a fortnight's time.
I look forward to that, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.